out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube. We're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant, with another episode on living the wildlife for the geek fans out there. Today I wanted to talk about rabies, specifically bat rabies, because the fact of the matter is bat rabies is perhaps the most common way that most humans are exposed to the rabies virus. Sure, we can be exposed by skunks or raccoons or other rabies vector species, but the most common one for humans, at least in the United States, actually is from bats. And so I wanted to give a little bit of insight for those of you who are looking to get into wildlife control, because if you screw up this process with how to handle potential rabies exposures with bats, you can end up costing your client tens of thousands of dollars in wasted medical expenses, or you can kill your client. And so clearly this is one of the few areas in wildlife control where the actions of a wildlife control operator are clearly tied to health and safety and a surprisingly large amount of money, depending on if the person needs to get rabies shots and that sort of things to prevent the contraction. So let's talk a little bit about bat rabies here. First of all, bat rabies, like all rabies, is a lyssavirus. It's part of the family of the rhabdovirus family. So let me unpack that for you a little bit. The rhabdovirus family means it's a rod. So if you've ever had the rounded type licorice candy back in the day, or something like that, that's a pill or a vitamin that's more oblong, that's a rhabdovirus shape. It looks like a rod or a small rod. And so that's where so under electron microscope, the rabies virus looks like a rod. And it's a lyssavirus, which is a subcategory of the rhabdovirus. And lyssa comes from a word meaning rage. And so this is where you get the notion where a rabid animal is violent and angry and attacking things. So this is a term from history where the furious form of rabies is being accentuated here. Now, typically what makes rabies such a dangerous disease is that it leads to death. There have been a couple of cases where people have quote unquote survived. I think there was one out of Wisconsin where they treated the patient with large amounts of steroids, I believe, and the person recovered. And by recovery, my understanding is that the patient was able to walk out of the hospital, which is pretty impressive given that typically rabies is 100% lethal, but obviously that's not true anymore. So we're really looking at like 99.999% likely to die. So we want to be sure we're careful with rabies, because if we get it wrong, really bad things happen for us. And so what we find is, historically, I want to put this a little bit in historical perspective, rabies is not a new disease. It's been around for thousands of years. In fact, the ancient Greeks talked about animals displaying symptoms that were believed to be rabies. And more specifically, in the 10th century, a Persian physician, now Persia is modern-day Iran, and his name was Rabies. And he said, "He who eats the tongue or heart of a bat shall flee from water and die." And so those of you who know a little bit about rabies already know that part of the rabies is also called hydrophobia. In other words, you're afraid of water. And the idea is that animals that have late stages of rabies have difficulty swallowing because they're beginning to lose some neurological control of the muscles in their body. And so they avoid water because they don't want to drown by swallowing water and not being able to put it down into their stomach rather than their lungs. And so this idea of hydrophobia, fear of water, comes in there. So it's interesting that even this physician in the 10th century had a very interesting way of describing how people would contract rabies. So his argument is, don't eat the tongue of a bat and don't eat the heart of a bat. So stay away from bats. So this is clearly a reference, or most likely a reference, to rabies. So how many species have been involved or known to carry rabies? Well, I believe we have somewhere around 41, 44 species. I mean, the way the nomenclature changes around. Why don't we just say we have under 50 species of bats in the United States? Well, 33 of those species have been associated with rabies in one way or another. So, as a general rule, just think of rabies as being endemic to the bat animal group. And so if you're encountering a bat, you always want to keep that in the back of your mind. It doesn't mean you go around killing bats because, it might be rabid. That's just stupid. Don't do that. But the idea being is you be careful when you're encountering these animals, and that it could be because the reality is any mammal can carry rabies. And so any warm-blooded creature, including humans, can carry rabies. So if you're dealing with a bird, you don't have to worry about rabies. If you're dealing with a snake, you don't have to worry about rabies. You may have to worry about other things, but you don't have to worry about rabies. So rabies is a warm-blooded mammal. Dogs, cats, possums, raccoons, skunks. Now, you may say, well, I'm not worried about rabies when I'm dealing with squirrels, and that's certainly true. However, it doesn't mean that the squirrel can't have rabies. So the reason why, let me just take a little sidebar here away from bat rabies for a moment. The reason why some of these rodent species, such as tree squirrels, mice, rats, the reason why we don't normally see rabies in these species is not that they can't contract rabies, because they can, but because typically rabies is transmitted by a bite. So if a predator, which is carrying rabies, bites one of these creatures, what happens is the animal typically dies of the bite before rabies has sufficient time to infect their brain, where they can then transmit the rabies to something else. So it's not that a squirrel or a mouse or a rat can't contract rabies. They can. It's that the animal during the attack dies so that we don't encounter it, because the animal needs to be alive long enough for rabies to get into its brain and then down into its saliva glands, and then still have enough wherewithal to bite something else. So this is why you'll have cases of woodchucks, for instance, where woodchucks, are being a much larger rodent, can have rabies because they may survive an attack, let's say a bite from a fox or a bite from a raccoon, where they may survive that attack because they may defend themselves and be able to get away. So I hope that kind of clears that up again. So the idea being is, just because it's rare, and it's extraordinarily rare, so rare that your health department, if you're bit by a mouse, may not even consider that worthy of rabies shots. But that's a decision for them to make. But it doesn't mean that it's impossible. So it's just, we're talking about lottery level, mega ball level probability here. And so it's just almost beyond the pale. It's more of a theoretical issue rather than a practical issue. So I hope that kind of helps you understand the rationale when we're dealing with some of these smaller rodents. They can carry rabies, but it doesn't mean that the likelihood of them actually transmitting it to another animal is highly low because they normally die from the initial attack. All right, hope that clears that up here. So how serious is bat rabies in the United States? Well, let me try to give you some data here. So since 1955 to 2005, positive rabies in rats, in other words, positive rabies identifications in bats, not rats, in bats in the United States was increased to about 1,400 a year. So if you look at some of the data, you'll find that it's been steadily rising, and part of that's due to the fact that more and more people are becoming aware of bat rabies, and so more and more animals are being submitted to rabies labs to see if they're rabid, and then they can decide whether there needs to be an exposure. In other words, a prevention testing and that sort of thing, where you have, if there has been an exposure, then people go through the preventative shots. So those numbers have been increasing because greater awareness has led to greater testing. So again, we're talking about, these are submissions of bats where the bat was tested to be positive. Now, there's a lot of bats that are tested that turn out to be negative. However, these were positive tests of rabid bats. So to put that in context, between 2001 and 2006, 10,000 bats, or actually the actual number is 10,453 bats were tested. Of that number, only 9% tested positive for rabies. So you can see there's an enormous amount of bats being tested, but out of all those testings, only 9% tested positive. So how does this 9% number compare with the common number you may have heard from various biologists that say only 0.5% to 1% of all bats are carrying rabies? So how do we get this massive difference between biologists who tell us there's only 0.5 to 1% rabid bats in nature, but yet when we look at the testing, we're getting 9%? Well, here's why. It's what's called selection bias. So because how you gather your data influences what the results are going to be. Let me give an illustration that's going to be not rabid bat related. If you're trying to do a survey of criminality in the United States, you're going to get a different number if you're interviewing people on the street, in an ordinary street of any city in the United States, as compared to a survey that you did inside the local county jail. That's known as selection bias. So there's a difference between a random person you're meeting on the street, or in this case, a random bat that you're meeting in nature, versus a person that you're meeting in jail, versus a bat you're encountering inside of a structure that may have had an exposure to people. So the reality is that when bats are encountering people, there's a higher chance that bat is sick. Because normal bats don't want anything to do with people, because we're big and we're scary and there's no way they're going to be able to eat us, and so they want to run away. It's sort of like, why would you, if you're 5 foot tall, why would you not express fear by someone who comes at you that's 6'5", 300 pounds and built like a rock? Why would you go up and punch that person? You just wouldn't do it. I mean, it's just silly. Same way with the bat. You're dealing with this animal that may weigh an ounce or so, looking at someone like me, almost 240 pounds. I'm like Godzilla to that bat. The same way with anybody else. Even if you had a 10-year-old to a bat, that child is a smaller Godzilla. So when you're dealing with situations where bats are inside of a structure And then inside the living space, that's where we normally walk around in our house. I'm not talking about attics here. I'm talking about kitchens and bedrooms and bathrooms, the living space of that home. If you're encountering a bat there is a higher chance that bat is sick. Not a guarantee. As you can tell, we had 10,453 bats tested in the United States between the years 2001 and 2006. But only 9% tested positive. So it's not a guarantee that it's rabid. It just means there's a higher possibility that it's rabid. That's that selection bias. That's an important statistical concept that you want to kind of keep in the back of your mind because it helps you evaluate scientific literature. Has the researcher gotten a true sample, or did he bias his sample by selecting only things that were more likely to fulfill his study goals? Okay, so that's the difference. So my point here is when we're talking about bats inside the living space, we don't want to be scaring our clients to death because chances are the bat isn't rabid. However, you can't tell your client that the bat's not rabid. You don't know if the bat's been rabid. You have to just simply treat it like an unknown, but we need to have the bat tested. So it's critical that you capture that bat in a manner that doesn't harm the brain. This means no tennis rackets, no baseball bats, no fly swatters. You need to have that bat captured in a manner that does not damage the bat's brain, because if the bat's brain is damaged, it can invalidate the test because they have to take the bat, cut the bat's head off, and then do its fluoroscope it to see if it's going to have a positive staining. Okay, so I don't want to get into the details on that. But you need to keep that in the back of your mind. That bat needs to be captured. So when does a bat need to be captured? Well, here are some of those guidelines. Your state may be slightly different, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. But as a general rule, anytime a bat is in the living space, not in the attic, just because a bat's in the attic doesn't mean there's been an exposure. Okay, we're talking about if someone says, they're calling you up on the phone, hey, wildlife control consultant, I found a bat in my bedroom. I'm immediately thinking that there's been an exposure. So if there's a bat inside of a bedroom with someone sleeping and they wake up, if the bat had access to someone who was sleeping, maybe they left their bedroom door open. If there was a child 8 years old or younger that was unattended, that was in the same room with a bat, you assume the bat bit the person. And you may say, why, Stephen, why are you assuming that the bat bit someone when you don't have proof? Why is the bat guilty of a bite rather than innocent of a bite until proven guilty? Why are we putting the guilt on the bat? Well, the reason for this change occurred because of some incidents that occurred in New York State in the 1990s. And so what happened was we had, I believe it was 1995, a 13-year-old girl began to have neurological problems. She was perfectly healthy, fine young girl, and she was starting to display some neurological signs. She's having some difficulties, so she was finally admitted to the hospital. Her condition got worse and worse and worse, and finally she died. And so they did an autopsy on her, and then, of course, they found out, lo and behold, she had rabies. And it turns out, as they began to investigate a little bit more thoroughly, she had a bat in her room about several months earlier. And what the state found was many cases of rabies exposures to bats. Most people did not know that they were bitten. There was no sign of them being bitten. And you say, Stephen, how is that possible? Well, bat teeth are extraordinarily thin and fine. So if you know anything about medicine, you'll know that really fine gauge needles, like think of the difference between the needle you got if you ever had an IV in the hospital versus someone who was taking insulin. The insulin needle is significantly smaller than the IV needle that you got in the hospital. And some of these needles can get extraordinarily small. So for the practical purposes, when a bat bites, the teeth marks are, I'm going to call it needle-like, right? They're really small. And what's interesting is that people who have been bitten by bats, who were awake and were bitten by bats, even when they knew where the bat bit, in a few hours, they could not see any marks anymore. I had a friend of mine out of Colorado who was bit, and he said, yeah, it hurt. And he went to the doctor in a couple of hours, and the doctor's using one of these magnifying glasses, and he could point to the spot where he was bit. It's not like he forgot where he got bit. The doctor could not see any bite marks on his skin. And the reason for that is the bat teeth are just simply too small. The skin heals up. So just because your client doesn't think that they were bitten, that's irrelevant. In fact, people that wake up in a room with a bat, it's often because they were bitten. They just didn't realize it. They have brushed the bat may have landed on them, and in their sleep they swat it away. The bat tries to defend itself, bite, and then bang. And what some of the research is showing is that the rabies that's associated with bats seems to do better in cooler environments, which of course makes sense because, the surface of your skin isn't that warm. And when the bat bites, he's not able to get that infection deep into your tissues to a lot of those nerve endings. So the virus has to have the ability of, with microscopic amounts, get to that nerve tissue and replicate. So you say, well, why is the bat so interested in people that are sleeping? Why does the bat care? All right. Well, there was an interesting study that was done. This is a theory. It's not a fact, and I'm not putting it out there as a fact, but it's a theory that says that bats that are sick are attracted to people or attracted to noises that are intermittent. Now think about that for a minute. You're in bed. What is an intermittent noise when you're in bed? Snoring, right? Of course, snoring. And so the belief is that bats that are ill are attracted to the snoring that has taken place, and that's where an exposure can occur. So let me try to I've covered a lot of material here, so let me try to rehash it again, just to be sure everyone's clear on this. If there's a bat in the living space where people were sleeping, I'm telling you, I'm very conservative on this side. Your state may have different policies and you need to follow your state, but I'm very conservative because I'm always afraid of getting sued. That if there's a bat in the living space, that bat needs to be captured and you need to have a conversation with health officials about whether that bat needs to be tested for rabies. Period. Now, there are other protocols out there. So typically what the CDC says, if there's a bat in a room with someone sleeping and that person wakes up, you assume the person was bitten. If the bat is in a room with a child that's 8 years old or younger, that is unattended with an adult, that child is assumed to have been bitten. If there's, pets in rooms, that's another, because there's a different protocol for pets and people, but typically with pets, you assume there was some sort of interaction with the pet and the bat. Then you have to ask the question, was the pet vaccinated or not? And that gets its own algorithm. If there was someone in a room with a bat who had diminished mental capacity, whether they had Down syndrome or maybe they drank too much the previous night, then you assume that person was bitten. So again, the burden of proof is to prove that the person was not bitten. And so it's very hard to prove that, right? So you assume the person was bitten until the proof turns out otherwise. Capture that bat. How do you capture that bat? Well, you would wait for the bat to land. So I tell people, first of all, make sure don't let the bat out of your sight. Don't open windows. You want to close as many doors and openings as possible to try to restrict the flight area of that bat. have thick leather gloves, get a Tupperware container, wait for the bat to land on the wall, go up, cover the bat with the Tupperware container, slide the lid between the bat and the Tupperware container, trapping the bat inside. And of course, you're wearing your thick leather gloves. I like using welder's gloves, but again, you may have a pair of gloves that you like. And then you tape that down, and then you start making phone calls. That is where that needs to be. But no tennis rackets. Don't hit the bat. Don't try to crush the bat. Do nothing to that bat that's going to damage that bat's brain. And do not let that bat go. Okay? So, where do you as a business owner go from here, knowing about the concern and about bats? Number one, we don't want to create panic. We don't want to create fear. But this is serious. So what are you going to do? Well, here's my recommendations. Number one, you need to create looking for my notes here, excuse me. The first thing you should do is develop a bat capture kit. And so to repeat what that is, you need a Tupperware container with a good sealable lid. I just used to use a Planter's peanut jar. That's what I like to use. They had a nice wide mouth. They were fairly narrow. I could hold them easily with my hand. And, you choose what you like, but something you need to be able to hold it with one hand, have good control of it. You want something that's metal, I would prefer, or something that's thick plastic because you don't want the bat biting through anything. Need some duct tape. You also need heavy gloves. That is going to be your bat kit. Now, the duct tape is so that when you capture the bat, you can duct tape that lid down so that there's no accident, that's not going to be accidentally opened. Okay. You can also then sign that duct tape in case, what time it was captured and that sort of thing. But you want to make sure that that lid doesn't just accidentally fall off. Step 2, contact your local health department or state health department, and you need to ask them, maybe it's the state epidemiologist, it could be the state rabies lab. You need to find out what the policies are, what the procedures are in your state for handling potential rabies exposures. Now, you need to get the information for all rabies exposures, but because I doubt they have a separate one for bats, but they might. Find out what that is. Now, typically what that will involve, it will involve an algorithm that the state uses to determine whether the bats need to be tested or the animal needs to be tested. You need to obtain that, not that you're going to be interviewing the client. I'm not going to encourage you to do this. It is not your job to make the determination whether your client was exposed or not. I think it's important for you to have that information so that you can understand what that process is. But you should not be getting in between your client and the health officials. That is not your job. And and I'm not a lawyer, but I think you're putting yourself at significant legal jeopardy doing that. But you need to be familiar with it. You need to find out if there's paperwork involved that you need to fill out to have that bat tested. So you'll be with the client perhaps. You want to find out what the emergency phone numbers are. You want to find out what the main phone numbers are. Who do you call if you have a bat in your possession? Who do you call to have that bat tested, and who's going to decide whether that bat is to be tested? Some states have as a function of taxes that if the health department determines that there was that there was an exposure, many times the state, through its taxing, will pay for the testing on its own. So there'll be no additional cost to the client. Those of you listening to me know that I hate the word free because it's often a lie that's perpetrated by politicians who want to convince stupid voters to vote for them. Okay, there's nothing free in government. The difference is that this will be paid for by ordinary taxes, so you don't have to pay for it again. You need to find out what that policy is. Who do you call? Do you have to bring the animal to the local vet to have it prepared? Are you allowed to prepare it? How should it be prepared? find out how do you get that bat to the place where it needs to go. When I was in Massachusetts, the policy was basically very simple. I would make some phone calls. They would decide that the bat needed to be tested or not. And if they did, then the bat, I could hand the container over to the family. The family could then bring it to the vet, or sometimes I brought it to the place where it would be prepared and shipped off to the rabies lab. You need to find out what that process is and make sure you get the regular day number and the emergency number, because these types of incidences often occur outside of normal business hours, and you need to know how to go about things after hours. Now, I'm putting some urgency in this. The fact of the matter is that rabies exposures are an urgency, but not an emergency. So just because there's a couple of days you're waiting doesn't mean everything. The person has to be running to the emergency room and all that. People can wait for the results of testing that often only takes a few days, the same way that you can wait a day or so if there's some sort of delay. What you don't want to do, typically your state may be different, but this is what you want to ask. You don't want to freeze the bat. Often they may ask you to kill it in a way that doesn't harm the brain, and you would then maybe refrigerate it or keep it cool until it can be tested. In situations where it would take an extended amount of time to get to the lab, there may be a need to freeze it. But that is a conversation you're going to have. You want to have a good, clear understanding, get all the paperwork that you need so that you're not hunting around for it when the pressure's on with a client. What do you do if you haven't captured the bat? That's a decision between the client and their health professionals to make a determination as to whether or not that family needs preventative rabies shots. Ultimately, you can see this is going to be a highly stressful situation for your client. Rabies shots can be very expensive, so it's imperative that you try to capture that bat or bats if there's more than one. Could be, typically no, but sometimes there could be. You need to be sure you capture this bat, because if the bat turns out to be negative, you have saved your client thousands of dollars. But if you accidentally or purposely let that bat loose without authorization, without that interview being done with the health department, you may have cost that family thousands of dollars in rabies shots. Now, there are situations when the health department or health officials, in consultation with your client, determine that there was no exposure. In those situations, and I would encourage you to have these types of things in writing, you can then release the bat outside. Always release it on high in a tree or some sort of object. Bats don't fly well from the ground. Putting a bat on the ground just makes it vulnerable to other predators, risking another potential exposure or another possible exposure. So you want to go to the tree and put the bat up on the tree and do the exact opposite, reverse the order of things that you did when you captured the bat on the wall. But again, make sure you have all of your documents signed, because I can just tell you, people's memories change when you leave the property. Make sure you have everything written out to the nth degree. I can't emphasize this enough. When I was in business doing this sort of thing, I had paperwork on what rabies was, rabies exposures, and I would hand that to the client. I would then record in my paperwork, client received this rabies document. These were publications not that I created. These were publications created by our state's health department and wildlife agencies. And I would hand that and then record it on my contract that the patient was signing. And I also had paperwork from the health department that I could help fill out for the client. if there was a potential exposure that we needed to have that bat tested for. And this is where your skills about handling client fear, client stress, you're under stress because this can take some time on the scene that you don't want. You have another client probably yelling at you to get down the road. This is not a situation that you want to screw up, because we're dealing with people's lives here, and we're dealing with thousands of dollars if there's a mistake. So don't let that happen. Make the phone call to the health department before you have your first bat call, before you have your first rabies potential incident. Find out what the processes are for your state. Be very, very clear about this before you have that first encounter. It will save you an enormous amount of headache down the road and really help your clients protect their own health, the health of their children, the health of their families, and save them potentially thousands of dollars. Kind of beat this horse pretty hard here, but this is serious. And I think, and I've met wildlife control operator, at least one, perhaps more, at least one, where they didn't do it right. And it seems that they won. They got away with it. That bat person didn't get bit, or there wasn't exposure, but they screwed it up. And they dodged a bullet on that. You may not dodge that bullet, and it may cost someone's life, or it may cost you your business and the lawsuit and the whole thing. We don't want that to happen. Bat inside the living space, that bat needs to be captured in a manner that doesn't damage its brain. Contact health officials. Find out if that bat needs to be tested. Was there an exposure? Let the health department, health officials make that determination. Learn about the process, because health officials can make mistakes too. But understand that algorithm. Find out what that process is. Protect yourself and protect your client. Don't let a bat loose that's found in the living space unless you have clear names, signatures, information that there were no exposures, and the determination from health officials was that there was no exposure. Now, sometimes, even when state health officials determine that there was no exposure, sometimes your client still wants the bat tested. That's something you need to investigate. There may be a charge for that. Sometimes it's not very much. I think when I was in Nebraska, the cost was $45, $65, I think, plus shipping. So we're not talking about a huge amount of money. You need to learn about that as well. This is because sometimes your clients can get quite nervous and they want to have confirmation that that bat wasn't rabid. Even when the state said there was no exposure, you need to determine how you're going to handle that as well, and what type of fees you're going to institute for handling that sort of thing, or whether your client can even do it in the first place. So that is something for you to also consider. Ultimately, rabies is serious. Thankfully, we have ways of preventing rabies infections. Make sure you are on the positive side of protecting your client health and for their family, as well as we want to be sure we're not killing bats unnecessarily just because someone saw a bat fly by outside and thought they were exposed. We're dealing with bats inside of living spaces, or where there was a real potential of an encounter with that bat. I hope you found that helpful. It's complicated. It's subtle. Make sure you get that information, read it carefully, follow it religiously. Don't be afraid to call for help with your health department should you encounter this in the field. Do this in advance, though, before you have a situation. My name is Stephen Van Tassel, Wildlife Control Consultant. Have a great day. Back to you, Frank.
Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your pest geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube. We're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Steven Van Tassel with today's topic.